So today we're going to be talking about hemoglobin and how it transfers oxygen from our lungs to the rest of our bodies and the biochemistry behind that. So, what is hemoglobin and what does it look like? Hemoglobin is a protein that is found in our red blood cells. This protein is a heterotetramer, which basically just means that there are 4 subunits and all of the subunits are different from each other. There are 2 alpha subunits and 2 beta subunits. And this protein has 2 different conformations. There is the R state, which has oxygen latched onto it. It's very oxygen rich. And then there's the T state, which does not have oxygen latched onto it. It's oxygen poor. The R state is referred to as oxyhemoglobin, and the T state is referred to as deoxyhemoglobin. Each subunit of the hemoglobin has a heme group in it, and each heme group has an iron atom attached to it. And this is where oxygen binds onto the hemoglobin. It binds onto the iron of the heme group. When hemoglobin is in its R state, that is the oxygen-rich version of hemoglobin, the iron atom is at the center of the plane of the heme group. But that makes it easy for the oxygen to latch on to the heme group of the hemoglobin. But when the hemoglobin is in its T state, which is the oxygen poor version of hemoglobin, the iron atom is not at the center of the plane, of the heme plane, making it difficult for oxygen to latch on to the heme group. So hemoglobin's partial pressure is 26 torr. So basically, when the hemoglobin is in the vein, when the red blood cells are in the veins, the hemoglobin is half saturated with oxygen. And then when it's in the arteries, it's almost fully saturated. It's not completely saturated, but it's almost fully saturated. And this graph explains what cooperative binding of oxygen to the heme group is. As partial pressure of oxygen increases, the hemoglobin has a higher affinity to the oxygen molecules. But as partial pressure of oxygen decreases, the hemoglobin has a lower affinity to the oxygen. So if you think about it, when we breathe oxygen in, our lungs has a high concentration of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen in our lungs is really high. So there are a lot of oxygen molecules that are getting ready to latch onto the heme group of the hemoglobin. So once one oxygen molecule binds to one site of the hemoglobin, that influences other oxygen molecules to bind to other sites of the hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has a higher affinity to oxygen in the lungs because of the higher partial pressure of oxygen compared to other parts of the body. So as the red blood cells travel to other areas of the body, there will be lower partial pressure of oxygen, and this lower partial pressure of oxygen in other parts of the body decreases the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen molecules. When the when the red blood cells that are rich in oxygen reach other parts of the body that are not rich in oxygen, like the capillaries, the surrounding tissue has a lot of carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide will then enter the bloodstream through the capillaries. Once the carbon dioxide enters the capillaries, it'll interact with water, and then the combination of water and carbon dioxide interacting with each other, that will convert it to bicarbonate and a proton with the help of carbonic anhydrase, which is an enzyme that is found in red blood cells. The protons and the bicarbonate will then get taken up by the hemoglobin. And this will trigger the hemoglobin to conform to its T state and then will release the oxygen molecules. So remember, when it's in its R state, it's rich in oxygen. which it was prior to arriving to the capillaries. And now that it's released its oxygen because it took up carbon dioxide and bicarbonate and proton, now it's shifted to its T state, and it'll release the oxygen molecules into the surrounding tissue. Now that the hemoglobin is in its T state with the proton and bicarbonate, it's going to travel, the red blood cells are now going to travel through the veins to the lungs. And again, at the lungs, there are a lot of oxygen molecules. The partial pressure of oxygen is very high. So the hemoglobin is now going to take up oxygen molecules that are now in the lungs, and it's going to revert back to its R state, triggering the release of the proton and the bicarbonate. Then the proton and the bicarbonate is going to convert back to carbon dioxide and water, again with the help of that enzyme. And then we breathe out the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide and the water interacting with each other to make a proton and a bicarbonate with the help of carbonic anhydrase is actually what changes the pH of the blood slightly. It doesn't change the pH of the blood too much, but it still does change. So in the tissue, the pH is 7.2, in the lungs, it's 7.4, and in the blood, it is 7.6.